Whenever you flush a toilet, wash your hands, or basically do anything that involves water in a drain, the leftover stuff ends up where I work. It's an often overlooked necessity of any somewhat large town. Although, I would almost argue that it's basically just as important as a police station or a fire brigade. There would be no place to live if the ground was basically inundated with crap all the time, and not even considering the extreme environmental impact. It would just be gross. I've worked at a wastewater treatment facility for about 14.5 years now. I would have to say that it's arguably one of the best jobs in terms of pay and job security. I would recommend it to more people if the smell of raw sewage wasn't such a turnoff to most. Although actually, it's least in my mind. It's hardly that bad unless you're standing right next to the main intake line that feeds the waste into the bar screen. It's also important that if you had any water from, well, basically any source, it's probably been through a couple of treatments before. Keep that in mind when you take a nice swig of water after a particularly tough workout or a long day at work. I don't mean to say this to gross anybody out. Frankly, once the water is processed, it's not only clean enough to pump back into the rivers and creeks, but it's clean enough to drink. I say basically because I don't want to get sued. Please, don't drink treated wastewater right out of the filters. Anyway, my 14 years have been, well, interesting to say the least. Most people, after contorting their faces in disgust after I tell them what my job entails, seem to think that it must be incredibly monotonous, and frankly, they wouldn't be wrong. Well, they would only be slightly wrong. I do have to say that every once in a while, there is something that you find entangled in the bar screen that really leaves you with a lot of questions. I suppose I should explain how this whole thing works for the sake of clarification before I go any further. The untreated raw sewage comes in as a single flow of water. A bar screen is the real first filter. It's essentially a vertical conveyor belt that consists of several horizontal bars, and that are spaced far enough from each other to catch anything overly large. It also does a rather good job at clearing out any inorganic material, wet wipes, condoms, tampons, wads of paper towels, and pieces of plastic. And those are the bulk of what is retrieved in this filter. Its purpose is to take these large and non-organic chunks out of the other bits of sewage, separating them, and allowing the rest of the sewage that continues to be organic, and therefore decomposable. Due to the nature of this filter, most of the strange things that I found were retrieved here, although some of the stuff has continued on to the next part. After that, it runs through another sort of filter, and a similar process happens, although by using a different method. The water is spun at a specific rate, kind of like in a top-loaded washing machine, and as gravity does its work, the heavier stuff settles at the bottom. This stuff, which is mostly just poop, is taken to a warehouse on the property, and with the magic of some chemistry, it's turned into some very nutrient-rich blackish clay-like paste. It's normally sold to farmers as a better version of manure, and as someone that's used part of it on my garden, that stuff works better than any Miracle-Gro I've ever used. And plus, after it's processed, it doesn't even smell like poop anymore, just smells like wet dirt. After this, the water passes through a bunch of clarifiers, which are basically huge basins. Oxygen is pumped through the water, and as that happens, natural bacteria begin to eat all of the nutrients in the poop water until it's clear. This is repeated around 3 times, at least in my facility, and after it's checked for its purity and sterilized with UV rays, it's released back into the river that runs through the town. I snicker to myself when I see people fishing and swimming in that river, but like I said before, it's actually pretty clean. And now that I'm done explaining everything, I suppose that I should actually start off. My first freak occurrence happened about a week into the job. I was a fresh-faced biochem major, and even though the smell still made me gag at that point, I was determined to move up the ranks. I got the job thinking that I would be able to climb the corporate ladder, eventually culminated in being the head chemist. This never happened, but my dreams were certainly a bit optimistic to say the least. Anyway, as I drove my crappy Mazda MPV down the dirt road towards the main office, I noticed a huge gathering of people around the main intake channel. I initially thought to ignore this, but then I noticed somebody in a white lab coat. They had a confused expression on their face. The people who worked in the lab almost never visited the actual sewage lines, like the general workers did. So this piqued my interest enough for me to check it out myself. As I approached the gathering of people, I could hear an apprehensive tone filling the air, as lab technicians and laborers like me all wore worried expressions. I had to push people out of the way in order to actually see what was going on. To say it shocked me would be an understatement. The water looked like pitch black, glassy like obsidian, and viscous like molasses. It smelled like burning plastic. This would have been enough of a conundrum if it weren't for the fact that these weren't the only things. The surface of the water swelled and wriggled, and it took me a moment to realize that there were probably hundreds of thousands of worms squirming under the surface. In fact, as I looked at it more, it seemed that the blackish water was probably just coating the worms. And as we tried to figure out what the hell was going on, we realized that they weren't just on top of the water. The main channel is about 20 feet deep, and as we tried to separate the masses of worms with a large stick, we discovered that the worms went all the way down to the bottom. Eventually, the main supervisor of the facility told us all to go home, and that everything would be fine the next day. We laughed at him, although surely enough by the next shift, everything was back to normal. And to say that the majority of my coworkers and I were seriously confounded by this would be doing a disservice to the word. But there was one coworker of mine that was hardly fazed by any of this. I only really worked with this guy for a couple of months, and one day he just didn't show up for work. And ever since then, I never actually heard anything about him. I'm not about to give out his real name, so I'll call him Vasily. He clearly wasn't from here. His thick Slavic accent was enough to give that away almost immediately. He told us that he was from Kiev and that he had moved here with his wife and 3 kids, although I never heard him talk about them once at all. He certainly was quite the character, and even though this sounds really mean, I tried to avoid him unless it was absolutely necessary for me to talk to him. I wasn't alone in my aversion for Vasily though. In fact, the people who I worked with referred to him as the vampire, due to his unfortunate and uncanny resemblance to the monster in Nosferatu. His head was bald and his face was so angular, it looked like his cheekbones were cut out of stone. His eyes were so dark brown that they looked totally black, and his trademark, wide-eyed, almost predatory gaze felt piercing enough to bore holes in you. He was around 6'6" and his whole body was just really long. It reminded me of an arachnid. His mannerisms didn't really help his cause either. He was the type of person to just stand a little bit too close and make a little bit too much eye contact during a conversation. And every once in a while, I would spot him staring at me as I worked on something by myself. Despite this, he was actually fairly harmless and was quite the hard worker. Part of me had the suspicion that he might have been on the spectrum or something, and I felt really bad for him. I even planned to work up the courage to try to get him invited with the rest of our coworkers to hit some bars, although he politely refused the offer and waved his veiny hand away, claiming that he didn't like beer. Since I was new, my only experiences with him were basically ones after the whole worm thing, but according to my coworkers, he acted much stranger and much happier than normal after the accident. One of them, let's call him Travis, even heard him laughing his head off near the main intake channel during a night shift right before it happened. Of course, he eventually packed his stuff up and he left without any sort of notice, which prompted the supervisor to call the police. He was never ever late, and my boss feared that something had happened to him. Once the police broke into his studio apartment, they found nothing. All the rooms were empty and it was like nobody had ever lived there. Travis actually accompanied the cops on their wellness check, and he claimed while he was inside of Vasily's apartment, there was just the faintest smell of burning plastic, although Travis was always the type to embellish. In the weeks, months, and years after this, my coworkers and I did our best to try and rationalize this as much as possible. Adrian, one of the only lab techs who ever taught to the general workers, theorized that the black sludge was somehow a diluted form of the fertilizer that we make. He hypothesized that there was some sort of runoff, and as the nutrient-rich solution mixed with it, and thickened the sewage flowing through the main intake channel, worms in the surrounding dirt swam in to eat the poop and dirt mix. It was a theory that my coworkers and I had to accept. I mean, looking back, it was so full of shit, but we had to believe something. Of course, not everything I've found has been so strange. All these things are still really unexplainable though. One time while I was monitoring the bar screen, I noticed that it was almost straining, like it was carrying a really heavy load. Upon further investigation, I found out that it was carrying a really heavy load. It was a freaking bowling ball, a 16-pound bowling ball. I really don't know how somebody managed to fit an entire bowling ball into the sewage system, but there it was, all shiny, despite the fact that it was coated in a thick layer of last night's dinner. And we still have the ball too. It actually sits in the room where the bar screen can be watched, right next to the poop money jar. I think that the title of the jar is self-explanatory. When I first joined, it was around $522, and now it's almost up to $900. The bar screen room is my primary position in the facility, since even though all of our noses are desensitized, I can actually stand the smell of poop for hours and hours on end. A feat which most people who work here aren't exactly able to do without getting a little bit of fresh air. It might seem silly, but my position is important for several reasons. Mainly, it's just a good safeguard to make sure the screen is actually working. If for whatever reason the screen malfunctions, the flow needs to be redirected immediately. If any of that stuff normally gets filtered out and it ends up stuck in the basins or the pumps, blockages can form. And when you're dealing with thousands of gallons a minute, you cannot have any sort of blockages. And my job also serves a sort of secondary purpose. Criminals tend to flush down the evidence if law enforcement is on their tail, and it's our job to recover said evidence and report the items to the police. I probably uncovered untold amounts of weed and thousands of crack pipes during my 14-year tenure. There is a normal amount of this stuff found pretty much every year, but I noticed that there is a sharp increase during the years of 2008 to 2010. Obviously, this lines up with the recession, and as a result of increased poverty and unemployment, our area, which already isn't really a white picketed fence suburb, had a dramatic crime increase. I actually didn't feel much of the pain of the economic slump, since the city is always going to need people to deal with sewage, but I certainly realized it to be true when I discovered that the MPV was missing one morning. To be fair, I did leave the windows open, but never in my mind did I think that anybody would want to steal that old hunk of shit. I was wrong. All of this really did culminate in one event though. I had arrived in my new Civic this time, and as I manned my post, I prepared myself for another day of watching the screen filter stuff out. I noticed that there were a couple of brownish boxes that were bundled in tape. They floated at the top of the sewage, and as I watched one after another swim by, I made sure to radio my supervisor. We recovered 40 little boxes of this stuff, and surprise, surprise, they were kilos of cocaine. Some people from the DEA arrived, and they tried desperately to figure out where the kilos had come from. Although by the point that they had arrived to us, the poop had degraded everything to a point that no arrest could be made from cocaine that we found. They told us that this stuff was between $800,000 and $1.2 million in worth. There was a notable police presence on the site for about a week after the incident. I suppose they were trying to see if any more kilos revealed themselves to no avail. And this annoyed me at first since they made an officer sit right next to me during every shift. And it was kind of frustrating to hear somebody continuously complain about the smell for hours on end. Eventually, the cops gave up, and they left the site with empty hands, which was really damn convenient, because about 6 days after they left, I found something else. It wasn't a kilo of cocaine this time. The news was all over the city, and search efforts were widespread. A blonde-haired, fair-skinned girl was drawing with some chalk in her front yard when she seemingly vanished out of thin air. There were no leads, no evidence, and only one real witness. One person thought they saw an unfamiliar beige Chevy Astro speeding through the neighborhood in which the girl lived around the time of disappearance. That was all that the detectives had. I remember watching the news during this, and since I had a bit of interest in true crime, I followed it extensively. I watched as the father of this little girl got thinner and thinner with each news appearance, and I can still hear how broken his voice sounded when he begged whoever took his little sweetheart to give her back safely. Eventually, the news stopped running stories about the little girl, and I just assumed that whatever had happened was done and that she was already dead. She had been missing for about 5 months when I found her. It was a heavy, dark blue comforter, and as I put it aside and I expected it, I realized that it was covered in some dark brownish stain that wasn't feces. As I unfolded the blanket and I felt around it, my fingers brushed something kind of hard, and as I scrutinized the small hard bits, they looked like little white pebbles. Unsure of what to do, I radioed my supervisor again, who called the police. I was rather unamused by this. If anything, they would be snooping around the facility again, and that was something I really didn't look forward to. On the other hand, the blanket was seriously out of place, and I knew that something was really wrong. My fears were confirmed when I saw detectives from the FBI canvassing the whole place a couple of days later. Interrogation rooms really have some sort of magic that makes you feel like you're guilty of something, even when you know you're not. I would have to say that those 3 hours were some of the worst in my life, and as a stern-faced man in a suit questioned me, I felt like I was going to pass out. I felt my stomach drop even further when they told me about the nature of their questioning. The stain was predictably blood, which isn't really something that causes too much alarm for me. Tampons obviously exist, and sometimes you genuinely just cut yourself on accident. Not every bloodstain is murder after all. It is what they told me next that made me really sick. Those little white pebbles were identified as teeth. Teeth that most likely came from a child's mouth. DNA evidence proved that the blood and teeth belonged to the little 8-year-old girl, who had gone missing a couple of months ago. There was also an unidentified male whose DNA was found on the blanket. One tag was still on the comforter, and it was traced back to the purchase in 2006 by a realtor and a mother of 3. When she was questioned, she claimed that she had given the blanket to her youngest son after he had moved out of the house. Of course, he was the next to be questioned, and from what I've heard about the case, that sick son of a bitch barely lasted 30 minutes before he admitted to everything. Even if he said nothing, they already had a good case on the guy. His DNA matched the unknown male's DNA, and the little girl's hair was found in his garage, and on his clothing. He had sold a beige Chevy Astro on Craigslist about 2 months prior, and his new car had traces of her blood all over it. He eventually told them where her body was, on the condition that he could escape the death penalty, and eventually they did find her. She was buried under a massive oak tree in a forest preserve 20 miles away from the treatment facility. By the time the cops found her, she was already mostly decomposed, but they were able to tell how she died, and by using dental records, they found out that the teeth in the blanket matched hers as well. She had several stab wounds to her chest, and a post-mortem blunt injury to her face which knocked out her teeth. There was also a great deal of internal trauma. The man had done things to her several times and kept her locked in this house for a couple of months before finally killing her. According to his own testimony, she had tried to escape and, in a fit of rage, he stabbed her 14 times and then wrapped her corpse in a blue comforter. The killer said that during a particularly harsh turn, her body slid and slammed into the right side of the door handle in the back seat, busting her face open. He eventually buried her in the closest wooded area, and then tossed the blanket into a nearby stream. He was smart enough to know that his best bet was to cast the blanket as far away from her actual burial site as he could, in order to distance the evidence as much as possible. What he didn't know was that the stream was actually used as a wastewater channel from a car factory, and that it led directly to us. I think almost half of the people working at the facility at that time quit, simply due to the media circus, and the fact that there was some sort of secondhand guilt that permeated through us. I remember for the very first time, feeling that I was totally useless. I thought back to my initial reaction and I hated myself for it. Some girl had just died, and I was a bit more concerned about cops being a headache. I actually had to testify in court, along with a couple other of my coworkers, and as a result, we got to watch the whole trial. The little girl's father looked like a skeleton at this point, and his eyes were always glinting with tears. I couldn't possibly imagine what he was going through. The guy got his wish, and instead of being sentenced to death, he was given life without the opportunity of parole. Ever since then, my coworkers and I rarely do anything outside of work. It's just demoralizing now, at least for me. Although I guess there are other reasons for our chemistry being really bad, especially after what happened last year. Travis had always been the jovial type, and frankly, he pretty much was the only person who kept my spirits out of the gutters for so long. Without him, I don't really know what I would have done after that murder. Of course, he was still the type to tell a couple of white lies every once in a while, so when he told me that he was having a son, I really didn't believe him at first. It wasn't until he showed me the photos of his wife's ultrasound. I was really happy for him. Frankly, it was a nice turn for the positive, all things considered. He named his son Blake, and my God, he never stopped talking about Blake for about 1.5 years after he was born. Of course, I was genuinely happy for him, but the man knew how to talk for hours and hours. After about 1.5 years though, I noticed that he didn't bring up Blake nearly as much. I attributed this to the fact that he had finally run out of things to tell us, and he wrote it off as unimportant. Every year we have a Bring Your Kid to Work Day. This is a holiday that is normally only honored by the people who work in the labs. Even if I had a kid, I would never want my child sitting next to me in the bar screen room, which is why it was a surprise for me that Travis was actually going to bring his kid over. I remember when he told us that his son had a keen interest in seeing what we did here, and I remember thinking that it was a joke. But I stopped that when, for the very first time, I noticed that he almost looked nervous. As the day got closer, I could tell that he was worried about it, and it certainly did weird me out that Travis of all people would be uncomfortable. I initially attributed his fear to the fact that he was scared about what his kid would think of the place. But when the day actually arrived, I understood why he was so scared. There was a reason why he didn't really say much about his son. I watched as Blake rocked back and forth, and he flapped his hands fervently, occasionally making a strange noise, or hitting himself in the head. For this reason, he wore a dark blue helmet, which shielded him from his own blows. He was wearing a weighted vest and he clutched a yellow bunny doll in his left hand. I knew this array of symptoms well, mainly since I have seen them in my own sister. I could tell that Travis was incredibly scared. He undoubtedly felt all of our eyes on him and his son, and I began to feel really horrible. Part of me almost wanted to try and convince the supervisor to not allow this, for Travis's own sake. He almost looked sick as he waved to us, trying and failing to sound like his normal cheery self as his son hit himself in the face. Travis was experiencing a great deal of embarrassment, and it was awful to watch, even from afar. Although I didn't voice concern, Blake could have been autistic, but he was still a young boy and Travis was his father. And if Travis wanted to take his son to work as a nice gesture, then damn it, he should be allowed to do so. I think it was 6 hours into my shift when I heard the radio call. The day was painfully normal, despite the fact that I noticed little kids walking all over the place with their fathers in tow. But that all changed really quick. It was Travis on the other end, and he sounded like he had just seen a ghost. He was bent over, wrenching on something, and when he looked back, Blake was gone. We all mobilized as much as possible and began to scan the whole facility. I remember even giving Travis a playful punch in an attempt to calm him down. We would find him soon, of course, we would. We did find him eventually. He was in one of the secondary clarifiers. It turns out that the bacteria that decompose poop also do a good job at decomposing people. And even though poor Blake was probably only in there for a good 40 minutes, he had already started to bloat. It took another 10 minutes before he was finally retrieved from the large pool of murky water. I did my best not to look, and I tried to shut my eyes, but my morbid curiosity got the best of me. And as they pulled a white sheet over Blake's head, I spotted a now brown bunny still clutched in his left hand. On some nights, I'll hear the way Travis screamed that day, and it'll wake me up and keep me up. I've heard some terrible things, but hearing him beg God to give his son back, that's just the worst. I'm convinced that there is no greater pain for a parent, or for anybody losing their child. We all watched the security cam footage, and I felt my stomach churn as I watched a small figure walk up to the clarifier. As he walked along the balcony that's above the water, he dropped his little stuffed animal, and it sank into the turbid water. He jumped in after it. Blake was 7 years old and he had autism, and he couldn't swim. Couple this with the fact that he was wearing a weighted vest in order to keep him calm, and you can picture what happened next. He sank like a rock. It also pained me more when I noticed a large figure walking near the clarifier after Blake had sunk. It was Travis, looking around wildly. This was about 3 minutes after Blake had sank, and if Travis knew where his son was, he probably could have saved him. Obviously, Travis didn't really come back to work for a while after that, and so I was tasked with covering his shift, something that I was happy to do. Travis normally worked at night monitoring the clarifiers, making sure that airflow temperature and nutrient content all looked right. I wasn't terribly experienced at this, but I figured that I would eventually get the hang of it. And after a while, I was good enough to be left alone without somebody watching me. And as Trevor recovered psychologically, I found my new home at the clarifiers. I specifically avoided the clarifier in which Blake drowned, only going over the balcony quickly, before going into the control room to check out how the levels were. I probably did this for 2 months, until Travis finally got well enough to come back to work. And by that, I mean that he didn't break down crying whenever he stepped foot in the facility. If it were me, I would have just quit. But Travis had been working there since he was 18 and for longer than me. This was basically his whole life, and it's easier said than done to just get up and move on, I guess. Every time that he worked clarifiers, he still made me check the one that his son had fallen into. He might have pulled himself together enough to work, but he certainly was not all okay up in the head. Understandably, his whole demeanor changed. He went from being the class clown to being almost as withdrawn as the vampire. The change made me feel quite bad for him, but every time that I tried to talk to him, he was aloof and uncaring. I stopped really trying to talk to him after a while. I just figured that he wanted his space, and all things considered, I would give him his space gladly. I think it was this space that I gave him mentally that allowed me not to break down when I heard the news that he had taken his own life. I always hated funerals, although I think I hated this one the most, simply due to the fact that the whole event was just stained with Travis's guilt. His wife almost reminded me of the little girl's father, and his whole family just looked horrible. Pretty much everybody that I worked with attended, even most of the lab techs showed up. Our supervisor gave him a eulogy, and I really did my best to say a couple of nice things about him, although my words were broken and softly spoken. I remember vomiting and passing out as soon as I got home, and when I woke up, I drank myself to sleep again. The whole thing was just so wrong on so many levels. Travis was probably one of my best friends at this point, and he was always such a good-spirited person. The fact that he was the one who was dealt this short stick in the game of life was just so unfair. Once again, I was the one who had to cover his place until we could find and train somebody else to cover his spot again. The facility felt empty without him, and I just hated every second of my job because of it, but I did continue on. Travis would have been disappointed if I left now. Eventually, I got accustomed to the absence, and even though it still felt wrong, I think I got used to it. That was until the month anniversary of his death. I was in the control room, monitoring the clarifiers like normal, when I noticed that one of the secondary clarifiers had a rather strange alert. The temperature is reading 35 Fahrenheit. Just a bit of background, the actual night air was 75 degrees Fahrenheit. Water is normally colder than air, and that's not too unusual. But 40 degrees colder, that was unheard of. I initially suspected a faulty sensor, but then I remembered that we had replaced them all no longer than 3 months ago, and the sensors we have last for decades. The air was muggy and it aroused a bit of sweat on my face as I ran over to the clarifier in which Blake had drowned. I knew something was going on when I noticed that all the lights around it were off. I clicked on a flashlight and I pressed on, breathing heavily as I climbed up the metal stairs, and I got myself onto the balcony. I ran along the metal grate floor towards the temperature sensor, and as the beams of my flashlight bounced around, I saw just the slightest hint of yellow in the water. I aimed the flashlight to the yellow and I felt sick to my stomach. It was a yellow bunny rabbit doll, floating in the water. I whipped the flashlights all over the place and I spotted more and more of the bunnies, their black, button eyes staring at me. I think I screamed, but as I did, I could feel the grated metal underneath my feet begin to crumble. Our facility is about 50 years old. The balconies were rusted quite a bit, but they never really seemed weak or unsafe to stand on. I remember how cold the water was, and how the murkiness swallowed up any sort of vision I could have underneath the water. The balcony was about 15 feet above the actual surface of the water, and so when I hit it, it disoriented me quite considerably and knocked the breath out of me. I realized that I didn't know which way was up anymore, and as my diaphragm tensed up in shock, I began to flail my arms around, doing my best to get my bearings fruitlessly. Eventually, after my body began to hunger oxygen even more than before, I just went limp, and I let my body float up with the bubbles of air. I took a deep breath as I surfaced, and I hurriedly swam to the edge of the basin. Once I was back on dry land, I peered out into the clarifier again, and all the yellow bunnies were gone. After a couple of days, all the balconies were replaced with new ones, in order to prevent such a thing from happening again, and the temperature sensor was replaced too, although it was found to be in perfect working order when they took it out. It was safe to say that my position was considerably cushier than before after the accident. During my struggle to escape, I really messed up my hand on some brick, and considering that I was swimming in poop water, I was in shock when I got infected a day later. In an attempt to keep me from suing, they bumped up my pay and cut my hours a bit. Not that any of it mattered to me anymore. That was 11 months ago, And today, after a long time coming, I finally put in my 2 weeks notice. Frankly, I should have quit a long time ago. I wasn't really moving up the corporate ladder like I had anticipated, and now that Travis was dead, the job was just depressing. And that's all ignoring the messed up stuff that happens there. I only work on Monday, Wednesdays, and Fridays. Sometimes people work here 6 days a week, 10 hours a day. I really wonder if they've seen anything else. I'm fairly certain that they have. Right now, I'm basically planning to move to a different, smaller treatment facility. With my knowledge here, I think a smaller place would be a bit nicer. I just hope that I can distance myself as much as possible, although I know that's basically impossible at this point. Because every single time I drink some water, or I flush my toilet, or basically do anything, I know where that water came from, and where it will return. I know that it's all been laced with worms, cocaine, and murder evidence. I know that in a way, all of the refuse of society, just like the refuse that we defecate, has ended up where I worked. And now you do too. And plus I've noticed that my apartment now smells like burning plastic for some reason.